Who better to bring a blast of joy into our lives than the journalist, gardener, writer, and presenter of Gardener's World, Monty Don, whose new book, My Garden World, is out now. It captures his decades long love of the natural world, looking over the diaries and notes of his life, as well as reflecting on this very strange year. A year where so many of us have experienced the richness and wonder in rediscovering the nature that exists on our own doorsteps. Monty, welcome to the programme. What was it like poring over 60 years of notes and diaries?
Hi, Mariana. Well, too long. That's too long to pour over anything. I think it was obviously it's interesting to see the things that used to obsess you and how things have changed. That was the really interesting thing. Particularly, I mean, things like birds. Now, many of us take for granted. For example, we see a kite when we either drive along a motorway or above our homes. When I was a boy, they were one of the rarest things on this planet, and so in some ways things have improved, and then other things, are disappearing. Things like hedgehogs are becoming rare, which was an insane idea even 20 years ago, and so on and so forth. But the main thing as a writer was to be able to trawl through one's life and cherry pick the things that have consistently mattered and come through, and to share it and put it all down. Was a joy.
Were you surprised by some of the things that mattered to you as a boy? I mean, what do you recall of first writing as a boy, and when did you first develop this love of the natural world?
Well, as a boy, I grew up in the countryside and in the late 50s and in the 60s, when it was a very different world in many ways. And certainly my mother, there were five of us, basically used to feed us well and then kick us out and expect us to return for meals. And as a very sort of bookish child, I had this split existence between going and hiding with a book somewhere so I couldn't be asked to do any jobs, or going for a walk with the dogs, which I've always loved doing. And you go for a walk and you just notice. You notice the flowers, you notice the way that things emerge, and the hares and the rabbits and the birds, half of which I didn't know the names of, and some of which didn't particularly interest me. But looking back, what I realized is they did filter in. Things stick as a child, even if you're not quite sure of the process of it happening. And little things like when I was a child, elm trees were a major feature of the British landscape. There's hardly one left now. Obviously, sound. One of the things that I noticed, and lots of people have written and talked about this in lockdown, was the absence of noise from planes and trains and cars. So we could hear birdsong, and not necessarily the radiant birdsong like blackbirds and thrushes, but the subtler and the sometimes the overlooked, that has its own beauty. And so there were layers of subtlety that both sifted up through from my past and directly out from the garden, and met and found themselves in this book.
And why have you structured the book around the months of the year and the changing seasons?
Which is exactly what my publisher said to me. Because, and I did it without thinking, I think it's because I'm a gardener and I live the seasons very, very intimately. I really, really notice the weather change and the seasons unfold and or blossom, and also wane. And so to me, the whole of my exterior life is based around the calendar. And it was completely natural to observe things as they occurred in real time in my garden. So, the enormous events in my life, like the first swallow or the first cuckoo, or even the swallows leaving, have to be placed in a calendar time.
And it's also about how some months have their own individual treasures, isn't it? I mean, October approaches and you talk of the sight and smell of hops, a smell recalling the memories of your father brewing beer.
Well, my father was an avid home brewer before, and there were no kits back in those days. So he had one of my mother's stockings, which he would then stuff with hops and tie. And I remember the tied section hung over the side of this copper bowl that would be on the stove about once a month. And this hoppy, malty smell would just fill the whole house. And then that mixture would be mixed with water and yeast and then bottled. So then around where I live, which is Herefordshire, which is one of the main hop growing districts along with Kent, to drive through the October evening as the hop bines are being taken to the farms for processing, the countryside suddenly smells of my 5-year-old self and the house that I was brought up in, and my father, who's been dead for, what, nearly 40 years.
Well, interestingly as well, this isn't the book we might expect, about how to grow things, but really more about how we can all do our own little bit to make the world a better place. That by connecting with nature, we can create a sort of butterfly effect, if you will. Is that what you believe?
I think you've got it exactly. I mean, I profoundly believe that. I think that in many ways we're all seduced by the glamour of the drama of extinction and catastrophe. And because the bar has been set so high with these incredible films of snow leopards and emperor penguins and elephants and what have you, that we've rather overlooked the drama that is happening literally on our doorstep or outside our tower block window. And it's really important that if we want to change the world, we have to connect with it directly. It has to become our world, not something that's happening out there. And on top of that, the wildlife, and it's just as, a robin perched on a spade handle is just as much wildlife as an elephant or a leopard. It's fascinating, and it all has a story. And as you know, that life is made up of stories. And if you can tell that story so it has your voice and your meaning in your domestic space, then the world comes together and then things start to happen. Otherwise, it's too big. It's too scary.
How much do you think that during this strange year you've learned about yourself and the natural world? I mean, has it been enlightening despite your many years of writing and experience to date?
Obviously, because if you write a book like this, you do a lot of research, and I've done a lot of reading, and inevitably you just want to look up something about robins, and you end up reading 2 books about robins, and 99% of it never gets used. So on that level, on an academic level, yes, I've learned a lot. But on a profounder level, I think it's that the whole connection of life, the web that can't be broken, is absolutely central to my experience of the garden and the landscape and the outside world. And gardens for me have always been linked to landscape. I've never seen myself as just a gardener. The countryside and the mountains and the sea and the coast and all our landscape is connected. And without caring for the little insects and the very ordinary little brown birds and the mice and even the rats and the slugs and the snails, we're not caring for the world. And so for me, I knew it, but it was driven home more forcibly.
And do you think that it's impacted also on people who weren't necessarily preoccupied with the natural world around them, and perhaps became more aware of it during the COVID period? I mean, I was just so interested coming back to London as I did after the few months of lockdown and seeing sort of window boxes that had been abandoned now bursting with living things growing, and it felt in a way that people had perhaps found their way back to something more simple with the time they had apart from anything else.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, all the evidence is that for the first time for many people in their lives, they had time to regard their gardens and their parks and even their streets as something they could observe rather than either be busy in or scurry through. I mean, we all see people rushing to work with headphones on, they're looking at their phone, they're either making a phone call or they're reading their WhatsApp messages or whatever it might be. And in a way, we garden like that. I'm as guilty as that as anyone else in the media. We give people jobs and tasks, and we measure these things by success, whereas actually good gardening is enjoying it and being aware of it. And I think that the great growth of interest in gardening and walking and being outside in mental health and well-being is all connected to this. So that there has been a burgeoning. I mean, for example, Gardener's World has doubled its figures. Now that's not accident. More people are interested, and long may that last. And I hope more younger people too.
And for you, what is it about the sheer feeling of being outside? I mean, rain falling on you, the power of the elements. It doesn't have to be a sunny day, does it? We all sit waiting for the sun to shine so we can scurry out like little moles or something. But for you, that's definitely not the case.
Well, it's partly because I go out whatever. I mean, unless it's hideous, and obviously, I conveniently become a writer when the weather is awful, and become a gardener when it's good. But um, yeah, I think it's experiencing weather and experiencing nature and experiencing climate and seasons as something that has a rhythm and an ebb and a flow that you can be part of. You are part of, rather than something that you observe or dip in and out of. And once that happens, and it's easy, I mean, there's no great mystery to that, then you embrace it and absorb it. And cold is as real as heat and wind and rain. And that sort of great mystery of life that connects us all is for certainly personally, and I know this is shared by lots of people, is incredibly empowering and energizing and yet very simple. It doesn't need explaining in great depth. It's there, you are part of it, you are fully alive, and yet you can be humble about it.
Monty, despite your regular exposure and embrace of the elements, which we were just talking about, which is supposedly very good for our mental health, you've spoken about your depression in the past, and I wondered how much you feel, your love of nature has been a solace, but obviously not enough of one to be a cure.
No, I mean, I think there are two things. On a personal level, depression is something that I probably became aware of when I was a teenager, but I've had on and off all my life, and there's no doubt about it that for myself, and I really feel ill-equipped to preach about this in any way because I'm just not the right person. Getting outside and at all, even literally just walking to the end of the garden and back, helps. And if you can then get outside and do something, then there are a number of things happen. I mean, not least, you stop thinking about yourself. One of the aspects of depression is it is completely self-centered. And you're aware of that, but you can't control it. And so that the cycle of loathing yourself for yet just another good reason for loathing yourself continues. So if you can, one of the things about gardening and reason why it's so good for you is that you have to focus enough in order to do it and give it all your attention, but not so much that it's stressful. So this thing of mindfulness, of engagement, is very, very healing, and more people are realizing that. And I think it's a process that, I mean, I talked earlier about this rhythm, that if there is hope, if you plant a seed and it will grow and it will flower and spring will come, then you hang on in there. And for a lot of people, hanging on in is as good as it gets. But if it gets you to tomorrow, well, okay, you start again. And then gradually you build on that.
Some people get quite romantic about the closing in of the evenings, all the death and decay of autumn. But for others, it is a warning of worse to come. And I wondered, as a sufferer of sad as well, what your tips are to help people as the dark nights approach. How do you stop the mood from sinking?
Well, if I knew Mariella, I'd do it.
Not a
It's
brisk walk, Monty, surely.
Yeah. Well, I think okay. What do I do? Always get up with the light. I mean, it is never lie in bed after dawn, because so get up, however you're feeling, whatever you want to do, use the light. Get outside. If you've got, I mean, this is wonderful having a dog or a pet of any kind that needs a walk. Take the good that is there. So if it is at all sunny, or if there is a sort of brisk wind blowing and you can wrap yourself up and go for a walk, take it. Take it with both hands. Exercise is really good for me. I find that works, and I try in winter particularly to really, I do exercise every day. That matters. And I think there is a kind of natural hunkering down that you have to accept. When the days are, I mean, I find November and December really difficult. But you just have to, there are times when the news tightens a bit around you. The days are less, there is less. And you just have to let yourself not hibernate, but just slow enough in order that you can rebuild. And I think that's, personally, I find that really difficult and quite a hard thing. And it's taken me most of my life to sort of get my head around that. But I think there is wisdom in that somewhere.
I think as a Scandinavian, it's just one of my life skills. My main life skill is a talent for hunkering down. You know, I think I'm sort of biologically equipped to deal with the dark, long, freezing months by just, making sure my duvet is really, really soft and warm and just waiting for spring to come. And I think it was spring, wasn't it, one May in the 1970s when you were working on a building site that completely changed your outlook on life. What happened?
Well, it wasn't a building site, it was my parents' garden. I was 17. And so we're going back to what, 1971, 72. And I'd been expelled from a couple of schools. And at 17, I was an angry misfit. At least I felt I was a misfit. And clearly, I wasn't making a great success of my education, but I was at a day school locally. And by 17, I'd been gardening for 10 years and I knew how to do it. I wasn't enjoying it at all. It was just a chore. It's like chopping wood or washing up. And I came back from school. It was March. It was spring. It was one of those sort of early days of warmth when you just feel the sun on your flesh for the first time. And I had a cup of tea and I went outside to sow some carrots because that was part of the rhythm of my life then. And I prepared the ground, and I can remember the soil, this fine, slightly chalky tilth. And I drew a groove in the ground and I poured the seeds into my hand. And I was filled with a kind of ecstasy that suddenly it was as though everything I'd ever wanted in life was there in the palm of my hand. I mean, it was an absence of desire because I had everything that I wanted. And when you're 17 and your main thoughts are towards sex and drugs and rock and roll, a handful of seed is not really what you're expecting. So that was very odd. And that night, I had a dream where I put my hands into the soil and they grew roots deep, deep down into the ground. And when I woke up, I felt completely rested and calm. And ever since then, I've known that I need to get my hands into the soil. But that is where I begin and end.
That
And that's what heals me.
that really is a Damascene revelation, isn't
Yeah.
it? On a scale. For someone who so intimately studies nature and the seasons, how much are you seeing a shift in our own climate, with the messages you get from your own garden and farmers who've had a tough year, too much rain, then not enough, poor returns on their crops. I mean, it's a very changeable, strange time, even without a pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, gardeners are right on the front line of this because we notice these things every day. And there's no question that in my lifetime, and it's accelerating over the last 25 years, spring is about 10 days to 2 weeks earlier. Springs are generally warmer. Summers are warmer but cloudier as a gardener. We have less sun and more heat, which is actually a very unsatisfactory combination. Autumns are better. Our autumns are becoming lovely, but wetter. And then winters are warm and wet and horrible. I mean, we have cold weather moments, but we are getting nothing like the same levels of frost and just a lot of rain. And that's changing the way we're having what we grow, where we grow it, how we grow it. And then spring is coming around February now. Primroses, violets, they're flowering Christmas time. So the seasons are stretching and behaving in ways we hadn't quite planned. I remember 30 years ago writing for same paper that you and I used to write for, an article about
One of us still does.
writing about how climate change was going to mean sort of Mediterranean summers and really cold winters. It hasn't been like that at all. It hasn't panned out. We're observing, but the changes are happening.
It's interesting to me. I mean, you've become more of a homebody, I'd say, since you had a mild stroke in 2008. And you record Gardener's World from Meadow, from your home in Herefordshire. And one of my favourite nature writers is Nan Shepherd, who spent her whole life walking the very same patch of the Cairngorms. And really, I've read travel writing by women from all over the world, but I keep going back to Nan Shepherd because as much as it's nature writing, it's a meditation. She notices new things all the time. And I wondered if, since you've stayed put more, whether you've actually found that you see more as a result.
Well, Nan Shepherd is the most wonderful writer too. I mean, just
The Living Mountain, what a book.
Yes, exactly. I think so. I think that I remember I used to do a radio program with the Natural History Unit in Bristol, and we were talking about the sort of sightings of rare and unusual birds, and how some people seem to see them more than others. And he said, well, there is just one secret of seeing interesting things. He said, that's looking. You've got to look if you want to see things. And if you are going to look, you have to give yourself time and space and patience, rather than bustling, instead of zipping around the world to see things. And you know as well as I do that there is that terrible traveller's experience. We go to film something or record something. You stay in a hotel that could be anywhere in the world. You fly on a plane that could be anywhere in the world. You arrive at the location. You interview someone really interesting, and then you're back in the nowhere world of airports and planes and things. And it's a sort of very dislocating experience. Whereas if you stay in the same place and look at the same thing every day, you see changes every day, even though it's the same place. And I think that slow accumulation, that accretion of observation is where it has real depth.
And just finally, how is the garden in Longmeadow looking today? Always plenty of work to
Well,
do,
it's
I
pretty good.
imagine.
We're filming today. I've broken filming to talk to you, in and out the rain. So it's not looking too bad. It's looking lovely.
I said finally, but actually there is one other thing I wanted to ask you, because I know that you lost your beloved dog, Nigel, in May,
Yeah.
and that you lost him the day after you finished the book, and he'd lain at your feet throughout the writing of it. And then you then decided to add more words, I presume, as a
Well, I
tribute
wrote a
to
sort of
Nigel.
epilogue, which was because he was, he'd been there. I mean, he was an extraordinary experience to have a dog that becomes incredibly famous. I mean, his death was front page news in the national newspapers. It was on television and radios. I took my car in to be serviced, and he said, "Oh, I heard the news about your dog." I said, "Oh, who told you?" He said, "Oh, I was watching the 6 o'clock news." And you're thinking, this is my dog we're talking about. And so on that level, that was odd and extraordinary, because to me, he was just Nigel, my friend. But he had been with me all the time. If I was outside, he came too. If I was writing, he lay at my feet. And suddenly, this great big bear is not there anymore. There's a space. So that the book, he was there in the book, even if I'm not writing about him. He was there all the time. So I felt I had to include him. And that's it. But actually, funnily enough, having written it and written about him and buried him in the garden, I'm sad he's not around, but I'm really glad that we had that time. I really think of him with affection and practically joy. I don't feel grief-stricken at all. So I guess it's worked out well right to the very end.